Hi, everybody. I'm Rodrigo Barahona, and I am the book review editor for the Psychoanalytic Quarterly. And today I am very happy to be interviewing one of our book reviewers, Iuri Conceicao. Iuri reviewed a book written by Stefano Bolognini and Luca Nicoli called Freud and the Changing World, Contemporary Psychoanalysis and Its Struggles, published by Karnak Books. This review appeared in issue 4 of 2025 of the Psychoanalytic Quarterly. Iuri Conceicao is a clinical psychologist in Massachusetts. He is currently working in private practice. He teaches the course History and Systems of Psychology and the Biological Basis of Behavior for clinical psychology programs. He has a doctoral degree in clinical psychology from Cal Lutheran, California, a master's degree in psychoanalysis, history, and culture from Birkbeck University in London, a master's degree in philosophy from the Nova University of Lisbon, Portugal, and a master's degree in clinical psychology from the Institute of Applied Psychology in Lisbon, Portugal. He is a member of the Corpo Freudiano in the US and the blog editor for the psychoanalytic group Free Association from Lisbon, an organization that promotes the teaching and learning of psychoanalysis. Yuri, welcome. Good to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you, Rodrigo. Thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure.
Absolutely. I'm looking forward to this conversation. So let me just say a few things. The book itself is structured in the form of an interview where Luca Nicoli, a younger psychoanalyst from Italy, interviews Stefano Bolognini, a senior analyst, also from Italy. Both of them are members of the Italian Psychoanalytic Society. And of course, Bolognini himself is a past president of the International Psychoanalytic Association. In this book, Bolognini and Nicoli discuss the challenges for psychoanalysis in the 21st century. Could you tell us what were the main arguments presented by these authors?
Yes, well, I thought it's a very rich and very thought-provoking conversation. And the two authors, they cover a lot of topics and themes and debates in contemporary psychoanalysis. But I would say that perhaps the main topics is that they're discussing contemporary subjectivity and its implications for psychoanalytical theory, but also psychoanalytical practice. So there's a wide variety of subjects, and it's very lively. I think very interesting. But some of the issues are, for example, the transference today, free association today, narcissism, alienation, and how can we think about these contemporary states of mind, and then also reflect upon the work of psychoanalysis and also psychoanalytical theory.
Yeah. So they're talking about, in essence, they're talking about, I guess, subjective states in and out of clinical practice and contemporary society and how we think about them in contemporary psychoanalysis. What are their ideas about subjectivity, the way that they think about it in today's world? Like, what are the changes or the shifts that they've noticed?
Yes, well, I think that one of the main issues that Nicoli and Bolognini discuss in the book is that nowadays subjects or individuals are very focused on their own selves, and that so it's a very narcissistic state of mind, and there's actually a terror of relationships. More precisely, there's a terror in becoming dependent on the other, and there's a terror of having an emotional, deep relationship with the other. And Bolognini here makes a bridge because he claims that these states of mind are also encouraged by a society that values disconnection, individualism, attachment to objects, such as, for example, technology, um, and that all of these discourses or conditions in society that they promote, they reinforce, they encourage these very, very dissociated states of mind. And then it's interesting just to add this, which I think it's very, very interesting, that Bolognini, I think he goes to the and Nicoli, they go to the to deeper issues. So what are individuals so afraid of? What are subjects so afraid of that's so threatening in the relationship with an other? And they say that it's related with the fear of loss.
Mhm.
There is a fear of losing the other, and therefore there's this perhaps this phobic organization that is very, very afraid of establishing meaningful, deep emotional connections with others.
Yeah, that's interesting. So it's as if somehow or another it is preferable to remain without relationships or to be objectless, way of putting it, rather than to risk the attachment to others that can be lost, right? Rather than to risk feeling lost.
Yes,
Yeah,
I think that's a quite good word. There's an aversion to risk and perhaps the dangers of a relationship.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So there is so the question of closeness, distance and closeness is something that's more to the fore in the subjectivities of today's society. You know, so in a way, I guess what you are saying is that their sense is that subjectivity nowadays is more on the narcissistic then and the objectless side. In your review, you mentioned the importance of aggression, the death drive, and the superego. These are staples of psychoanalytic metapsychology. And you write that you don't feel that they were explored very much in detail in this book. What makes you think about these elements as important to add to the mix here?
Yes, indeed. I do remember that Bolognini and Nicoli, they do mention sometimes this increase in violence. But I don't think that they explored perhaps in detail the implications of aggression, of hate. And it made me think a lot as I was reading the book, it made me think a lot about the death drive. And for example, um, if we think about Winnicott and the importance that Winnicott attributes to the environment, he writes that if aggression is not integrated by the environment, that it becomes split off. It becomes cut off, split off. And then I think he connects these ideas with the idea of the false self, because there's an environment that will not tolerate the aggression, and therefore aggression is not integrated into the ego or into the self. But of course, that I think that my thoughts were also related, of course, with Melanie Klein and the emphasis on the death instinct in the baby, for example. And so if there's no object, because we are talking about this absence of object, which I think is very, very primary, right? As I was reading the text, I thought about Andre Green and the dead mother, but the dead mother was there, and then it gets lost, and it's psychically absent.
Mhm.
But in this case, I think we're talking about an environment and objects and others who are simply not there, or are not there enough. They're not present enough for the baby or for the child. And so it made me wonder, so what happens to these? What happens to the death drive? What happens to aggression? What happens to hate? What happens to anger? Because they have no object. if we think about Klein, the projections of the bad objects, right into the partial objects, first into the breast, and then the reintrojection or the introjection in a different way. Or if we think about Bion, these beta elements that then do not get transformed into alpha elements and therefore remain undigestible or undigested by the psyche. So I think that there are very, very serious consequences, and I think Bolognini and Nicoli emphasize this a lot in the book. There are very, very serious consequences for this subject that does not have another. And I think one of them, for sure, is also this hate that needs to be cut off, this hate that is not integrated, this hate that has no chance of being transformed into something that could be digested or ameliorated by some kind of love or the good object. And then, of course, I don't want to go farther ahead here, but also if we make a bridge to society,
Mm,
um, there's a very, very interesting article by David Bell, and he talks about these primitive states of mind that are encouraged by today's society, and
mm,
especially, for example, from neoliberalism. That neoliberalism is this economic model, but also has implications on the psyche. And there's this infiltration of the market mentality into one's subjectivity and into human relationships. And these modes of subjectivity and relationships are based on competition, maximization of personal gain, for example, calculation of self, other, and relationships. So a very, very utilitarian, I think, way of being. And this creates also adversarial modes of relationships, of relating to another, that the other becomes something, someone that we need to defeat. The very, very adversarial, I think. So I mentioned the more kind of hateful states of mind because I don't think that the child, the baby, the subject is able to deal very, very well with the aggressive instincts and the aggressive impulses.
yeah. That makes me think. I mean, it makes me think of a lot of things. Of course, relating to contemporary society, especially the socio-political environment that we're living in today. But this question of the other as an adversary or the competition, to what it intrigues me. I mean, David Bell's. I've read some of his work, and I think I understand what you mean. But for the sake of conversation and to try to understand this, also to integrate it more with Bell as a psychoanalyst, but to integrate this more into psychoanalytic thinking, or at least traditionally, like to what extent does this stimulate what structures that are already there in the mind? For example, the social political environment, or let's say neoliberalism. Yeah, because to a certain extent, you could always say that the other or that the object is always in some ways hated, with or without neoliberalism. That the encounter with the object, the subject's encounter with the object very early on, necessarily promotes or produces a frustration that's going to cause an adversarial internal situation of hatred, these intense Kleinian sort of drives. And as object relations develop, a competitive dynamics begin to form. Edible dynamics, competitive dynamics begin to form in the mind. That traditional theory are endopsychic and perhaps then find a place out there in the world in our relationships with others. So I guess what I'm wondering is the role of society, the way that society is organized, economically, for example, neoliberalism. How does it impact what's already internal? Does it create new internal structures? Does it exacerbate weaker, structures in the mind that perhaps should not be exacerbated? Like, how do you see that interrelationship between the outer and the inner in this sense?
Yes, well, I think that's a very, very interesting question, and it's something that I was deeply, deeply worried when I was writing the review because I didn't want to add too much to what Bolognini and Nicoli were already discussing, which I think is already a lot. At the same time, I think I also felt a little bit jealous that they had this conversation and I was excluded from the conversation. And I don't know, maybe this was my way of dealing with my own jealousy that I wanted to be part of the conversation. But it takes me. I think your question is very, very important. It's been very, very debated in psychoanalysis, I think. And it makes me go back a little bit because I did my studies in psychosocial studies
Mhm.
at Birkbeck, and we had people there like Stephen Frosch, Daniel Pick, Zizek was also there, Ronald Britton, Michael Rustin, amongst many others, and David Bell too, who I think are very, very good at thinking between the intersections between the psyche and society, and they have very, very interesting works. Um, I, I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to summarize or say much, but we usually think of the psyche and society as binaries, as opposites,
Mhm.
or psychic reality, external reality, psyche, society, inside, outside. But in reality, there's a connection, there's a continuum between psyche and society. Historically, psychoanalysts have been criticized for internalizing human subjectivity and disregarding sociological, economic, cultural issues. And sociologists have been accused of reducing what happened or what they're trying to explain sociological events without taking into consideration what happens inside the mind. And so the psychosocial studies attempt to fill this gap and to create a relationship between the two. So there's this idea that we are psychosocial because each and every one of us has a very personal history, and we have an internal world, and we have fantasies, and we have desires, and we have anxieties. And then there's also the other part, which is the social, the psychosocial part of who we are, and also our subjective experience in our relationship with others, because we are relational, we relate to others, and also we appropriate some of these discourses or even ways of being or narratives that are out there, and then we internalize these narratives. And so I think it's a combination of both. It's very much that we try to understand, or we understand what happens to us, or we feel what happens to us as a combination between our internal world, but also, of course, we are also affected by what happens outside. And maybe just to add this, right, that I remember when that actually Freud said something similar in his group psychology paper. He said that something like there's really no distinction between individual psychology and group psychology, and I think this is sometimes quoted to uh, in a way also to show that Freud already had this something in mind. And of course, in his later writings, he goes on and he explores more sociological, anthropological um, um, issues. So yes, which I think was quite interesting.
Yes, absolutely. It is making me think about one of Bolognini's concepts that he writes about elsewhere. I'm not sure if it's in this book, but the concept of, I think he calls it subjectivity, but inter like INTER, not I'm sorry, intersubjective, right? Not intrasubjective, but like this INTER, subjective. And I wonder, does this use of that, does that apply to what we're talking about here, or how does he talk about it in the book, and in what way does it relate to this question of what is inner and outer?
Yes, I think that Bolognini and Nicoli, I think that they're very, very aware and they are trying to establish that connection between the inter and the outer. And just to say that I think that this book is very, very important because I do think that this kind of thinking, I think it's more alive, for example, in some countries in South America, some countries in Europe. And I don't see it as much alive here in the US, or at least I think it's beginning to appear this, but I don't think that's been very, very prevalent. Um, for sure, Bolognini and Nicoli, I think they're trying to establish these bridges between what happens out there and what happens in the psyche. I think that maybe they didn't go far enough. So, for example, Bolognini is explaining why is it that individuals are so narcissistically involved, so afraid of relationships, and why are they so afraid of abandonment? And Bolognini advances some explanations. For example, he says that mothers are not present enough for some kind of fusion between the baby and the mother to develop. Also, he also claims that caretakers are always on rotation
Hmm.
because everything is just so precarious and uh, things change at a very, very rapid pace. And the other thing he says, one of the other reasons he uses is also that family members are not as united, and sometimes people have to go to work to different places and become separated from the family. So now babies, children, parents, they don't have the support of the family. So that also has a lot of huge implications. So I think he does, or they, Nicoli and Bolognini, that they do advance with some explanations. Um, but what Bolognini um, mentions when he talks about the interpsychic or the intersubjectivity, I think
It's
it's a
actually,
little bit different from this.
yeah. Sorry, I'm sorry to say it's interpsychic. That's right. INTER psychic. I think I made a mistake by saying intersubjectivity, but please go on.
Yes, but I think he's alluding to that the goal of psychoanalysis also changes. It's a big, big problem that the transference isn't there. So a
Hmm.
fundamental concept for psychoanalysis, the transference, isn't there because individuals will not develop transference. I would even add that if there's transference towards psychoanalysis, it might be a little bit more of a negative transference. That sometimes patients or individuals in the uh, who work in mental health care, they have this negative transfers towards psychoanalysis, I think, especially maybe here in the United States. So we're talking about negative transference from the beginning of treatment or no transference at all. And so what Bolognini writes about, even in his previous writings, at least from what I read, he talks about this idea of the flow, that the goal of psychoanalysis is not necessarily to make the unconscious conscious or to, develop this apparatus for thinking thoughts or transform beta into alpha. He's more concerned with making connections, opening up channels of communication, establishing a flow between the self, non-self, between the unconscious, the conscious, between the analyst, the patient. So I think it's that space in between. And in this book, he says he gives a lot of attention to the pre-conscious as the space of passage, as the space of flow. And it's very, very interesting that I noticed, but I didn't add to the review that so there's a glossary at the end of the book with explanation, because the book is written, I think, in a very accessible way for people who are not very knowledgeable of psychoanalysis, but the unconscious isn't there, which is quite interesting, because one
Mhm.
thinks, with the unconscious, the transference, that these are fundamental psychoanalytical concepts. But Bolognini is talking more about that, opening up those channels of communication, those channels of flow, uh, um, maybe um, encouraging some kind of being attuned to the analysand or the patient, and encouraging some kind of relationship or some kind of curiosity about oneself, because that's a big problem, that Bolognini also mentions in the book, is that if there was no object there, uh, then the subject, the individual, internalizes this relationship and becomes very, very, very disinterested in their own unconscious, and also very alienated from how they feel, their desires, their fantasies, their internal world, etc.
Yeah, I don't know if this is the same as what you're referring to, but it seems to me like some of these concerns are not new. I mean, perhaps Bolognini is talking about contemporary times in terms of the last 40 or 50 years, but certainly Andre Green in 75 and afterwards talked about these types of states of mind. Of course, borderline states, narcissistic states, but the idea of that the if the patient meets up against an analyst who is not an object or not object enough for them, that they will end up internalizing the sort of absence, for example, is inherent in the whole dead mother concept that you alluded to earlier. And what Green's recommendations were that had to do with the analyst being a little bit more of a person, not that he becomes, not an analyst or brings his personal self into that or personal life into that session, but he responds more affectively, responds more fully, or is paying attention to the patient's way of relating to them, or perhaps the way that the patient can't find them unless you're a little bit more present. And that there's something about returning back to the patient, something real, that becomes very important. It has to do with narcissism. I don't think Green would have thought about it in terms of the patient doesn't have a transference. I think he and others would think of it as a quality of the transference. It's not the same type of transference, perhaps, that Freud talked about, like such a fully objectal or Oedipal transference. It's something more narcissistic or more part object. But nevertheless, it's something. There's some sort of an attachment or a transfer of parts of the self, into the other, even if it's nothingness, right? Like even if it's absence or lack of structure, that's transferred into the analyst. And so, so there is something happening between the patient and the analyst. It's not just no transference or else hatred. Oh, and or the idea that hatred is always there present, from the start. I'm not sure if it's Green who said that, but I think Kleinian analysts would think that from the very beginning, there's also hatred, just like in the very beginning of, let's say, psychic life, there's both love and hatred towards the object, that would be there. And it sounds like Bolognini is maybe making a distinction between sort of a full kind of more mature type of transference or no transference at all, or thinks or feels that hatred is an obstacle rather than potentially something that developmentally is expected in the relationship with an object. I'm not sure if he addresses that, or if you can say anything about what your impressions are, and also if you agree with some of these ideas of his in terms of the clinical implications.
Yes, for sure. I think that a lot of the ideas that are discussed here in this book, and I think that it's a difference, because it's not an academic book, so it doesn't have a lot of references. But But yes, a lot of these ideas have already been pointed out by so many others. Some psychoanalysts, like you were saying, Andre Green said something related, but I also thought, for example, Christopher Lasch and his I think 1979 book, um, The Age of, how is it called? The Age of Narcissism.
Let's
I
say
think so.
yes.
I forgot the name now. Yes, where he describes that he's specifically focusing on North American society, and is addressing these narcissistic ways of being, which excludes relationships with others and this kind of self absorption. I also remember Zygmunt Bauman also in his books about liquid modernity also talks that in liquid modernity, there's a dissolution of all social bonds, in that individuals also don't want to relate to others. That there's a dissolution of everything that is solid in society, and everything becomes liquid, everything becomes temporary, everything becomes very I mean, mobile or always sliding, always shifting. Um, I think Bolognini, he does. I'm not sure to what point he focuses on this lack of objects or objectless, no transference. He does talk about the frustration that causes in the analyst, for example, that it becomes very hard. He says it's very difficult to find analytic patients nowadays, people who are willing to meet 3-4 times per week, for example, and people who are very invested in their analysis. So I think that's something that becomes very difficult. Um, yes, and he also says something about, yes, how difficult that is for the analysts. There's some kind of emotional exhaustion in perhaps trying to be very attuned and trying to make contact. Um, see if I
Yeah.
can remember. Yes, he also describes absences in society. Um, that it's difficult, actually. He says it's very difficult for individuals to find uh, absence in society, because we're always connected, for example, through technology, right? It's easy to see that we've never been so connected and so alone at the same time.
Yeah.
Um, and that society encourages these hypomanic states that we need to always be doing something. We shouldn't have any space or time for contemplation. We should replace. I mean, when there's something missing, when someone leaves, we don't linger on the loss or go through the process of mourning, for example, or have to deal with the frustration of the absence, which is very important. I think absence it's such an important concept for psychoanalysis, and I'm thinking, for example, about Bion's theory of thinking, um, and so it's very difficult to feel, yes, even lack, right? The Lacanians talk about lack, and of course that lack is related with desire. We desire because we lack something, and so it becomes very difficult to desire and to develop a sense of self if there are no gaps, if everything is always available at all times, if we just replace people. I mean, it becomes very complicated.
That's right. Yes. And there is something I'm guessing you're also thinking in terms of the sort of ideal, ego ideal that's projected in society of one must not feel lack and or one must not show lack. And there's something about perhaps this was Freud's sort of fundamental in some ways contribution when he introduced the idea of man not being at the center of his universe, that there's something about always understand being able to stay in contact with the contact, and be able to stay in contact with one's lack and interrogating it as constitutive of the self. In other words, if there's any coherence, it's around the lack. Um, that there's something about being able to sort of stay in that space, that gives one coherence. The incoherence of the self, the inherent incoherence of the self, is what grants one coherence. Whereas in contemporary society, what you feel is that people must fill up the lack at all times, and if not, they cannot hold the incoherence. You come apart. People will tend to sort of come apart and disintegrate. And that seems interesting. That there's a compulsion towards filling in the absences, and an intolerance for the absence, and an illusion that there are no absences, that everything can be filled.
Yes, yes, for sure. And and perhaps also, without deviating much from what we're talking, maybe there's also that expectation that the other, if there's a relationship with the other, that this other must be available at all times as an object.
Yeah.
And if this other isn't available at all times, then we think, they don't they don't love me, they don't care. But what I think you touched on a very important point that Bolognini and Nicoli also mentioned in the book, which is this tyranny of the ego ideal. There's this ego ideal that one needs to be productive at all times. There's this ego ideal produced, for example, by social media, that everything is so perfect and everyone is so much in control of themselves, right? As if the ego now became master of its own house, that everyone is always in control and is very productive, which of course doesn't leave any space for the unconscious. But Bolognini and Nicoli, they do talk about this tyranny of the ego ideal, which is always attacking the ego with these omnipotent, grandiose images of the self. To this point, I in my book review, yes, and I've also thought about the superego, that maybe the superego also becomes persecutory, but it's a very different superego. For example, and I think that Todd McGowan, in his books on enjoyment and jouissance and capitalism, he says that the old superego, if we think about the superego as this historical agency, that the old superego from the Victorian kind of repressive Viennese society was a superego of interdiction, of prohibition. You cannot, you shall not. And then, Freud saw, the hysteric patients who had to, in a way, to repress their desires and develop these somatic conversion symptoms. But nowadays, so this has changed a lot. And nowadays, it's not that the superego is not relevant, and that it's the ego ideal that is kind of in a way persecuting or tormenting the subject. It's that the superego became an imperative to enjoy.
Mm.
Just do it. Treat yourself. You deserve it. Indulge yourself. The sky is the limit. There's nothing you can do. So it becomes very persecutory. It becomes, if you're not living your life to the maximum capacity and being happy, happiness becomes very tyrannical, and it becomes persecutory. You need to be enjoying at all times. You need to be productive at all times. You need to be in control of yourself at all times. So it becomes very, very persecutory too.
Yeah, yeah, that you must enjoy. Yeah, yeah. Going thinking a little bit about all of these topics that they're talking about, Nicoli and Bolognini. It's occurring to me that the book was that these are Italian analysts, and the book was published in Italy in Italian and translated into English. Do you feel that? I mean, I think I know what you're going to say, but I wonder if you could say something about is this book and the ideas, are they applicable, to the United States, for example, to North America? And if so, how? Is there anything specific about North America?
Well, yes, maybe I'm being pessimistic, but I do think that I'm a bit more pessimistic than Bolognini and Nicoli in their book, even though, as I say in the book review, I think that the conversation becomes a little bit more tense and more pessimistic towards the end of the book. I think that these issues are present in North American society and much more in a much more in a more significant way, I think. So, for example, right, two examples would be right what I mentioned before, the culture of narcissism that Lash describes American society as very, very individualistic. Um, and there's this right the myth of the self-made man, of the
Hmm.
the person who um, who is independent and doesn't need anyone. Um, but I one thing that the book made me think about, for example, Bolognini becomes very critical of the healthcare system, that healthcare professionals, clinicians, they don't really listen to their patients, that patients are over medicated. And so it made me think, for example, um, in managed care, for example, in North America. And there's a very, very interesting article by Philip Cushman titled "Will Managed Care Change Our Way of Being?" which I think it's an incredible article where Cushman, one of his main arguments is that if we focus on cost cutting, making profit in this kind of managerial um, view of mental health, that we are changing on how we think about mental health and how we think about psychopathology and how we think about relationships in therapeutic relationships, whether they're between an analyst and an analysand, or a physician patient, or a psychologist and the patient, or a client, that it radically changes how we see these relationships and how we understand clinical work. So, for example, he mentions that we consider the self something to be able to be managed, transformed at will, calculable, objective, measurable. So the object becomes a thing. The person, the self,
Mhm.
becomes an object in the sense of thing. Really, really becomes um, a thing. And so I think that these issues are most of these issues are much more prevalent in North America. And I am a little bit more pessimistic than Bolognini. It makes me wonder if psychoanalysis is going to survive, because it is at odds with this kind of therapeutic discourses, that therapeutic interventions should be quick, fast results, should be based uh, on objective techniques, skills, um, and so I think that psychoanalysis is very, very ill prepared to face these challenges, and I think that's one of the reasons maybe why people like Bolognini and Nicoli are thinking about such issues. I know that one solution that sometimes I'll hear people say it. I wanted also to hear your thoughts on this. I think it's very, very interesting. I've heard people saying, psychoanalysts saying, so we need to we need to change psychoanalysis, which I think it's fair because, psychoanalysis was always an evolving discipline. I mean, Freud revised his theories so many times, and his theories, I think, were very, very much open to critical thinking and to be revised. But one issue is, should we make psychoanalysis more like a logical positivistic science? Because we need for psychoanalysis to survive. And I think that there's been a lot of more interest in, for example, in the literature of evidence for psychoanalytical treatment, randomized clinical trials, etc. I really think I'm thinking of Jonathan Shadler, right? He's been very much focused on these issues. But I think that one of the dangers is that we might lose the unconscious, because the unconscious does not connect very well as an object of study if we use logical positivism methods and theories. So I think this is very much open debate.
I mean, the question, it's a really good question. My thoughts, just really quickly about that. I might be maybe too optimistic, but my sense is, well, if psychoanalysis has to lose the unconscious in order to survive, it doesn't really survive, right? It becomes something else. And like I think, like you're alluding, well, like you were reminding us, psychoanalysis has been evolving, but it's been evolving more or less um, around the question of how to help people become more in contact with their unconscious. I think so. It's always been evolving in terms of technique, how to talk to people, and also meta psychologies. How do we think about people, and what goes on in their minds, and trying to adapt to the way that people have evolved over time, right? So psychoanalysis over the past 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years has been working with more narcissistic types of patients and changing its technique in ways to be able to make better contact or communication with them. So it has evolved to the point that there is debate in between psychoanalytic schools about what really is or isn't psychoanalysis. I know when I was doing my training, most of my patients, were of the types of patients that Bolognini is talking about. And the kind of work that I needed to do with them wasn't the traditional type of free associative patient just lies on the couch and is able to free associate in the way that I'm able to help the patient make connections in the way that we can work with more neurotically structured patients. That the patients that I was seeing most of the time coming through my door weren't structured that way and had to be talked to in a different way, or had to sit up face to face. Many of my patients come into analysis and are sitting face to face, and I have had to change the way that I work with them, following schools of analysis that have changed their ways of working with these types of patients, right? But always with the idea of trying to find a psychoanalytic way of reaching patients who are harder to reach because of their shifts in subjectivity. My sense is that if psychoanalysts or psychoanalysis has to try to adapt to this thing that we are talking about, is making people ill, it becomes ill, right? And it doesn't become any more solution to the problem. It becomes part of the problem. And I think that, and this is where maybe I'm being a little bit too naive, that the fast pace of society and the lack of spaces to be able to think about or be in absences will create or does create a need for those spaces to exist, and that the world in some ways is big enough for psychoanalysis to still occupy a place for those spaces. And so because we are missing so much of this in our lives, we need it more. And so my sense is that psychoanalysts are going to be more relevant. As these places get more closed up, psychoanalysts are going to be more and more relevant. That's just my take.
Yes, I agree. I think it's quite. I mean, I think it's probably one of the reasons why Bolognini and Nicoli wrote this book, because they are making us rethink the technique of psychoanalysis um, in face of the patients that we see nowadays. And I might be extending myself a little bit because I'm not an analyst. So when I say we, I say analyst, but I do practice from a psychoanalytical perspective. And I agree with you. I'm not sure if psychoanalysis is going to survive. Maybe I'm a little bit more pessimistic than you. But one thing I very much agree with you, and I think you said something very, very important. I think that we do need connection. We do need connection with ourselves, with our desires, with our fantasies, with our unconscious, with our dreams. And I think it's becoming more and more difficult in society to be connected with oneself and connected with others. And so I think that we will always need spaces of connection, of emotional connection, spaces where we can find meaning, spaces where we can be creative, spaces where we can dream. If that happens with or without psychoanalysis, I don't know. But I do think, yes, psychoanalysis is very, very important in holding that 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 ethical stance, right? The ethics of psychoanalysis. If not with psychoanalysis, maybe with something else. But I hope that that something never disappears, whether it's psychoanalysis or something else. That's something that will make us able to disconnect from the alienation, from the acceleration, from this idea that we should be entrepreneurs, that we should be performing and efficient at all times. And that's something that puts us in contact with our own internal world. And I think that opens up the possibility also for us to be able to open a connection for relationships.
Yeah, we're reaching the end of our very enjoyable conversation. I just wanted to ask you before we finish, you know, about a book like this, so comprehensive, in contrast to a book review that's got a limited scope, limited word count, for example. Are, are there, is there anything that you feel that you would have liked to have said in your book review about the book that you weren't able to because of this limited scope?
Yes, well, one issue, because the book was written in 2022, um, some things changed. For example, I thought that the AI and there's been a lot of debates around AI that I don't think were very much explored in this book, because at the time I don't think that it was that much prevalent. And one can say so many things about AI and be pessimistic and optimistic about it. Um, but I think that that's a very, very important topic that also has implications, of course, for psychotherapy and also in psychoanalysis and our relationship. I mean, what kind of relationships do we establish with AI? And besides that, I think that there are a lot of dangers. And I don't want to sound very pessimistic here, because I think AI can be very useful. I sometimes use AI when I'm doing searches or when I'm looking for something. Um, I think Paul Verhagen has an article saying that neoliberalism brings the worst in us, in a way that it encourages competition, uh, turns everyone into a commodity, turns the self into a commodity. Relationships are based on gains or financial gains, etc. And I think that AI has the risk of making us lose our humanity,
Mhm.
because, for example, I sometimes hear people who either use AI as psychotherapy, and I think that there are a lot of dangers. I think that there was this case here in the United States not so long ago.
Yeah,
I think of a couple of adolescents. I don't know if you heard this. One I
yeah,
think was called Adam, who committed suicide after many, many months of psychotherapy with AI, and then they went back. And I think the parents analyzed the AI scripts, and the AI would say things such as, you don't owe anything to anyone. Your parents gave you life, but you don't owe them anything. The life is yours, and you have the right to end it if you wish to. So very, very dangerous things. But one interesting thing also, or difficult thing about AI is, for example, people are now submitting job applications, and they are being triaged by AI. And so people are beginning to think, how does this algorithm thinks, and how can I bypass AI? So I think that there's a danger that we might start to think like AI.
Mm.
And I think that there's a risk that we might lose our humanity, but so much could be said about AI. So I think that was something that I had on my mind, that I think probably perhaps that Bolognini and Nicoli would have probably said something about this if they wrote the book today.
That's very interesting. As a society, we might turn to AI and ask AI, what do you want from me? And then become it. Yeah.
Yes.
Yuri, thank you very much. This was a fantastic conversation. I really appreciate you being here with us.
No, thank you so much. I just wanted to add that I actually had the chance to meet with Bolognini at the previous IPA meeting that happened this year in Lisbon. And he was a very, very nice man, very, very available. I think he also participated in some of the panels. So I had a chance to meet him, which was a little bit strange at first, because I'm in a way writing a book review on his ideas or his conversation with Nicoli, and then I have him in front of me, and I began, was it that I was too critical? Really like my book review, but he actually, yeah, I sent it to him, and I think he sent it to Nicoli, um, and he thought, I think he said that I was putting him in dialogue with other thinkers, and he appreciated that. So yes, I was very, very happy that I had then the chance to meet with him.
That's a great way to then end our conversation about this book.
Thank you so
Thank you.
much, Rodrigo.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Okay, Yuri. Bye.
Bye bye.